I didn't hear his car pull in. I heard the door. 3 quick knocks. Not angry, not hesitant, just efficient, like someone closing a deal. I set my coffee down and already knew who it was. My son never knocked like that unless he wanted something. He stood in the doorway with a face I didn't recognize anymore. Same eyes, same jaw, but the warmth that used to live there was gone, replaced by something measured and rehearsed. He didn't look around the house. He didn't ask how I was. He stepped inside like he already owned the place. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the table. That should have been my first warning. I stayed standing. He didn't argue. He pulled a chair back for himself and sat down instead. From his jacket, he took out a white envelope. Plain, no return address. He placed it carefully on the table between us, lining it up with the edge as if precision mattered. "Read it," he said. I didn't touch it right away. 32 years of working construction taught me something about paper. Contracts, waivers, liability forms. Paper is how people avoid looking you in the eye. Finally, I opened it. 4 words stared back at me. "Dad, I'm not your son." The room went quiet in a way that felt physical, like pressure building behind my ears. I read it again, slower this time. Same words, same clean, deliberate handwriting. I looked up at him. He didn't flinch. Then he said it, the part that mattered. "So," he continued, his voice steady, almost bored. "You don't need to remind me of everything you've done for me." Not yelled, not spat, just stated, like a policy update. I felt something shift in my chest. Not rage, not even shock anymore. It was something colder, something heavier. He leaned back and slid a folder toward me. Numbers, deadlines. A debt so large it didn't feel real until he said it out loud. He needed it by noon tomorrow. No flexibility, no discussion. "You've always said family handles things internally," he added. This is that. Family. I thought of the nights I came home with concrete dust in my hair and blood in my boots. Of the time my back went out and I finished the shift anyway because we needed the overtime. Of the checks I wrote without keeping copies because you don't itemize love. I didn't say any of that. I didn't defend myself. I didn't ask why. He mistook my silence for agreement. People like him always do. As he stood to leave, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced down without thinking. The screen lit up long enough for both of us to see it. Auto payment failed. Insufficient funds. He froze. Just for a second, maybe 2. Then he flipped the phone face down a little too hard and cleared his throat. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. "Don't be late." The door closed behind him. I stood there alone with the envelope still in my hand, realizing that this wasn't just a family argument. It wasn't even about money. It was about erasing a lifetime and calling it clean. People love to call stories like this a revenge story. But standing there in my kitchen, all I felt was the quiet ache of a man who had just been written out of his own life. And I understood something with perfect clarity. If he no longer wanted to be my son, then I no longer had to be his solution. He didn't wait for my reaction. He never did anymore. The moment the envelope stopped being a shock, he slid the folder across the table like a dealer pushing chips forward. The sound it made against the wood was soft, controlled, intentional. "This is the situation," he said. Inside were numbers, cleanly printed, highlighted in yellow where he wanted my eyes to land. interest rates, due dates. A total so large it didn't register at first. I had to read it twice before my chest tightened. By noon tomorrow. That was the deadline. Not next week. Not when you can. Tomorrow. Like he was ordering lunch, not asking his father to shoulder a debt that could crush a small business. It's not as bad as it looks, he added quickly. Once this is handled, everything stabilizes. Everything. His word, not ours. I looked up from the papers. He was already watching my face, measuring. He'd been doing that since he was a teenager, watching for weakness, for hesitation, for the moment he knew he could push. You've always handled things, he continued. That's kind of your role. My role. I thought of the years I handled things without anyone noticing, the layoffs I avoided by taking less myself, the weekends I spent fixing what other men walked away from, the back injury I never talked about because pain didn't pay bills. None of that was in the folder. You're good with money, he said, leaning back. You always have been. That wasn't praise. It was justification. He started explaining how the debt happened. Bad timing, a market shift. People who promised returns and disappeared once the money cleared. Every sentence carefully crafted to remove responsibility from himself and place it gently, inevitably, on me. Then he said the line that finally made it clear. You chose to help me all those years. That was your decision. Don't turn it into something I owe you for. There it was. The erasing. Not just of money, but of meaning. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I let him talk himself into believing this was reasonable, that this was fair. That what I'd done over decades could be reduced to a series of optional transactions. At one point, he mentioned the kids. Not by name, just the kids. Their future, their schools. The word future always comes out when someone wants to guilt you without sounding desperate. If you're listening to this, and you've ever had someone look you in the eye and explain why your sacrifices don't count, you already know what that moment feels like. It's not loud. It doesn't explode. It settles, like dust. I realized something then. He wasn't asking for help. He was submitting an invoice. When he finally stopped talking, the kitchen felt smaller. He watched me expectantly, confident, like a man who had already decided the outcome. I picked up the folder, closed it, set it down. I didn't thank him for explaining. I didn't tell him I needed time. All right, I said. One word, flat, neutral. His shoulders relaxed just a fraction. He stood, already reaching for his jacket. I'll come back at noon, he said. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. As he walked out, I stayed at the table, staring at the place where the envelope had been. The words echoed louder now than when I first read them. You don't need to remind me of what you've done. That's when it stopped being about money. That's when I understood that if I paid this debt, I wouldn't just be funding his mistakes. I'd be agreeing that my entire life, every hour, every sacrifice, had meant nothing at all. He was already halfway to the door when it happened. I hadn't moved from the table. The folder lay closed where I'd set it, like a verdict waiting to be read later. My son adjusted his jacket, checking his reflection in the darkened microwave door, the way he always did before leaving, making sure he still looked like the man in control. That's when his phone vibrated. Not a loud ring, just a sharp, impatient buzz against the wood of the table. He glanced down without thinking. I didn't mean to look, but the screen was facing me, bright enough to cut through the dim kitchen light. Auto payment failed. insufficient funds. For exactly 2 seconds, he froze. It wasn't dramatic. No gasp, no curse. Just a pause. Like a man forgetting his next line in the middle of a speech he'd practiced too many times. Then he flipped the phone face down. Too fast, too hard. The sound it made was sharper than it needed to be. "Doesn't matter," he said quickly, already reaching for his keys. "That'll be handled once you take care of this." Once you take care of this. There it was again. The assumption. The entitlement. The belief that my life existed to absorb the impact of his decisions. He didn't wait for a response. He never did. He walked out, confident, already picturing tomorrow as a formality. Noon. A transfer. A problem erased. The door closed behind him, and the house settled into silence. I stayed where I was. For a long moment, all I could hear was the clock on the wall and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Ordinary sounds, the kind that remind you the world doesn't stop just because something inside you has cracked. Those 2 seconds replayed in my mind, not because they were funny, they weren't, but because they were revealing. The man who had just told me my sacrifices didn't count, who had erased decades of work with one sentence, was still relying on the same invisible safety net he claimed he didn't need. He wanted to be free of obligation, but not of benefit. I stood up slowly and walked to the sink, rinsing out my mug even though it was already clean. Habit, routine, things that made sense when nothing else did. I thought about the first time he asked me for help. He was 23, said it was temporary, said he just needed a little breathing room. I'd believed him because that's what fathers do. They believe first and ask questions later. I thought about the last time he thanked me. I couldn't remember it. That realization didn't hurt the way the envelope had. It hurt differently. Duller. Like pressure behind the eyes. If you've lived long enough, you learn that betrayal doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives neatly folded, typed in clear language, delivered by someone who learned exactly how much you'd tolerate. I went back to the table and picked up the envelope again. The paper felt lighter now, less powerful, like it had already done its worst. He thought that message stripped him of responsibility. What it actually did was strip me of illusion. I didn't feel anger, not yet. I felt something steadier, colder. The kind of clarity that only comes when there's nothing left to lose. By the time the clock ticked past 9, I knew this wasn't going to end the way he expected. Tomorrow at noon, he'd come back for money. Instead, he was going to learn what happens when you tell the man who carried you through life that his hands were never needed in the first place. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was restless, because I was awake in a way I hadn't been in years. Clear, focused, the kind of clarity that doesn't argue with itself. I sat at the kitchen table long after the house went quiet, the envelope folded neatly beside my coffee mug. I didn't reread it. I didn't need to. The words had already burned themselves into a permanent place. You don't need to remind me of what you've done. That sentence did something strange. It didn't make me smaller. It made everything else fall away. By morning, the decision had already been made. When he came back, right on time, of course, I didn't invite him in. I opened the door just wide enough to look at him, standing there with the same confidence he'd worn the night before, the kind that comes from assuming the ending is already written. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded once. "All right," I said. One word, flat, neutral, no apology, no explanation. His shoulders loosened just a little. He took that word and filled it with his own meaning. Victory, relief, permission. He stepped back toward his car, already reaching for his phone. "I'll check back at noon," he said. "Don't complicate this." The door closed. That was it. No argument, no speeches, no last attempt to explain myself. Men like him don't hear explanations. They hear leverage. I locked the door and stood there for a moment, listening to the engine fade down the street. Then I turned around and got to work. The first call I made wasn't to a bank. It was to someone who remembered me before all of this. Someone who'd seen me break my back on a job site and finish the shift anyway. Someone who knew the story my son had conveniently forgotten. He answered on the second ring. "You finally done protecting him?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I am." There was no satisfaction in his voice, just understanding. The next few hours passed quietly. Papers came out of drawers that hadn't been opened in years. Folders labeled and organized with a precision that surprised even me. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. This wasn't anger. This was inventory. Every document told the same story. Every signature confirmed the same truth. Not just that I'd helped him, but that I'd done it at my own expense, again and again, without ever asking to be repaid. And now, without realizing it, he'd given me permission to stop. At one point, I paused with my hand on the envelope, considering throwing it away. I didn't. I slid it into the front pocket of my jacket instead. If he wanted to erase the past, he could look me in the eye while I returned the favor. By late morning, everything was where it needed to be. The house looked the same. The neighborhood sounded the same. Nothing had changed on the outside. Inside, something fundamental had shifted. I checked the clock. 10 minutes to noon. He thought I was getting ready to send money. What I was actually doing was stepping out of the role he'd assigned me, the one where my only value was what I could transfer on demand. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't bracing for impact. I was choosing the moment. And when noon came, he was going to learn what silence really means when it finally answers back. He arrived at noon on the dot. I know that because the security camera caught the moment his car stopped in front of the house, engine idling, like he expected this to take less than 5 minutes. A quick exchange, a confirmation, money transferred. Problem solved. He didn't knock this time. He tried the door. Once. Then harder. When it didn't open, he stepped back, confused, scanning the windows as if I might be watching him from inside, waiting to make some kind of dramatic entrance. I wasn't there. On the small table by the door sat a single box. Plain, unmarked. No bow, no note on top. Just a box. He hesitated before opening it. Not long, but long enough to tell he'd finally realized something wasn't going according to plan. The first thing he pulled out was a folder, then another, then another. The confidence drained from his posture slowly, the way water leaves a cracked container. His movements became sharper, faster, less controlled. He flipped through pages instead of reading them, skimming for the part where I'd made a mistake. There wasn't one. There were records of the help I'd given him over the years. Not just amounts, but dates, circumstances, notes written in my own hand, copies of agreements he'd signed and never read, insurance forms from the accident he pretended never happened, the one where I'd stepped in front of falling steel so he wouldn't be crushed beneath it, my name on the hospital intake, his on the beneficiary line. At the bottom of the stack was a copy of a document he recognized immediately. His signature froze him in place. He remembered signing it. He just hadn't remembered what it meant. That was the moment it finally clicked. When he said he wasn't my son, he hadn't freed himself from obligation. He'd freed me. The phone rang. He answered it without checking the number. "Sir," the voice on the other end said carefully, "we need to discuss your accounts." He lowered the phone, staring at the papers in his hands like they might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough. They didn't. Neighbors walked past. Someone across the street paused, pretending to check their mailbox. He didn't notice. He was too busy realizing that the leverage he thought he had never existed at all. I didn't show up. I didn't call. I didn't send a message. That was intentional. This wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about letting the truth stand on its own, without my voice softening it. By the time he finished going through the box, his hands were shaking. Not because of anger, because of understanding. He had spent years telling himself that what I gave didn't count because it was my choice, that my sacrifices were optional and therefore meaningless. Now he was holding proof that they had cost me something real, and that he'd benefited from every single one. When he finally looked up from the papers, the street was quiet again. The box sat open at his feet, its contents scattered like pieces of a story he could no longer rewrite. For the first time since the envelope, I wasn't there to absorb the impact. And for the first time in his life, he had no one left to invoice. I didn't disappear forever. I just stopped being available. For the first few days, I stayed somewhere quiet. Not a hotel. Not a place with room service or views. Just a small rental on the edge of town where nobody knew my name and nobody asked questions. I slept better than I had in years. 8 hours straight. No phone buzzing. No deadlines that weren't my own. Silence does something to you when you've spent a lifetime absorbing noise for other people. I made coffee in the mornings and drank it slowly. I read the newspaper all the way through, not skimming for headlines that might affect someone else's problems. In the afternoons, I walked. My back still ached, but it was a familiar ache, honest. The kind that comes from moving your body, not carrying someone else's weight. I didn't check my phone. I didn't need to. Through other people, I heard enough. He tried calling, then texting, then calling again. Not apologies. Questions. Confusion. The same tone he'd used when something he assumed was automatic suddenly wasn't. Someone told me he went back to the house the next day. Just stood there for a while, like if he waited long enough, the old version of me would show up and fix things. I didn't. A week later, his mother called me. Not angry. Tired. "He says you abandoned him," she said. I let that sit for a moment. "No," I replied. "I stopped rescuing him." She didn't argue. Time passed. The kind that doesn't announce itself. Days turning into weeks without anything dramatic happening. That's when real consequences start to settle in. No transfer coming. No quiet bailout behind the scenes. Just choices, stacked on top of each other, finally standing on their own. I thought about whether I should leave him something. Money, a letter, instructions. In the end, I chose something else. I left a door unlocked. Not literally, I'm not careless, but the kind of door that doesn't slam shut forever. If he wanted to come back, not for money, not with demands, not with invoices, but with humility, with honesty, with the understanding that what I gave had value, then I would listen. Listening doesn't cost me my dignity. Paying for someone who erases your life does. One evening, as the sun went down and the streetlights flickered on, I sat on the porch of that small rental, and felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not the loud kind, not the kind that needs witnesses, just the quiet relief of knowing I'd finally drawn a line that didn't move. If you've stayed with this story until now, I want to ask you something. No pressure, no speeches. Have you ever given so much to someone that they forgot it ever cost you anything? And if you have, what would it look like to stop proving your worth and start protecting it instead? You don't have to answer out loud. Sometimes just admitting it to yourself is the first door you unlock.